South Carolina State Senate District 41 Democratic candidate Sam Skardon once worked for United States Congressman John Lewis. The iconic congressman died on Friday at the age of 80. I talked one-on-one with Sam about his experience working for John Lewis for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Sam Skardon, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks for having me, Quintin.
You're very welcome. Unfortunately, I'm coming to you with some developing sad news. As you know, Congressman John Lewis, a civil rights icon who helped organize the 1963 March on Washington and served in Congress for decades, has died. His family confirmed in a statement to CBS News. And as you know, Lewis was 80 years old. The family said this in the statement, quote, "It is with inconsolable grief and enduring sadness that we announce the passing of United States Representative John Lewis." Many people know in the Low Country that you once worked for the congressman. Where are you emotionally?
Very sad, Quintin. Deep sense of personal loss and loss for our country. Congressman Lewis was a great moral leader, an extremely strong voice on issues of justice and equality and civil rights. I think we need that voice as much now as we ever have. And I think we'll all miss having his voice, and I'll miss having his guidance and friendship. He meant a lot to me personally, and I know he did to so many people around the country.
Who was John Lewis, the civil rights legend, and who was John Lewis as your boss?
One of the very rare things you can say about someone, a famous person, a elected official, someone in public life, he was the same person for both. He was the exact same dignified and principled and determined leader behind closed doors that he was in public, in front of the camera. Could not be more kind and gentler of a person, humble, even though he would take calls from presidents and kings and queens and other senators and congressmen, and had personal relationships with Dr. Martin Luther King. You would never know it. He acted like someone who, like I said, was just one of the most humble people you could imagine. Incredible memory, loved meeting with people and talking to people. When I was working on his staff, you always could come in on a Monday morning and know where he had been that weekend, because there would be a dozen phone calls and emails from people who had met him at the grocery store, at the airport, or the movie theater, because he would just stop and talk to all of them. It used to take him, when we had his office in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol building, he represented Atlanta in Congress, and he would take an hour and a half. The flight from Washington to Atlanta is an hour and a half. It'd take him about 5 hours to get home, because he would have to go to the airport early to meet everybody and talk to them for 2 hours before he got on the plane, and then it would take him another 2 hours to get from the airplane to his car at the airport. So yeah, it was he was a very personal person.
And the statement goes on to say this, quote, "He was honored and respected as obviously a conscience of the United States Congress, an icon of American history, but we knew him as a loving father and brother. He was a stalwart champion in the ongoing struggle to demand respect for the dignity and worth of every human being. He dedicated his life to nonviolent activism and was outspoken advocate in the struggle for equal justice in America. He will be deeply missed, that is." What would that conscience look like now in Congress without Mr. Lewis, Sam?
I don't know. That's one of the reasons I'm sad this morning. We have great leadership here in the Low Country with Congressman Clyburn and Congressman Cunningham. I think they're both extremely dignified, important leaders for us. But it's going to take lots of the next generation stepping up. That's what inspires me to be involved. And I know so many people whose lives he touched and who were inspired by him to get involved. There's massive shoes to fill. I'm not sure any of us can do it on our own, but we all need to work to do it together.
And how much of a struggle is there for equal justice, that is, in 2020?
I think there's a massive struggle, Quintin, as we've seen recently, the protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. Right here in Charleston, all the issues of progress we're trying to make in the 5th anniversary of Mother Emanuel. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we think of the civil rights movement as history that is past and over and done with. Congressman Lewis would always tell you it's an ongoing struggle. And I think this year, more than most, actually, we've seen example after example of how much progress we still need to make.
And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called Lewis, quote, a titan of the civil rights movement, whose goodness, faith, and bravery transformed our nation. How does this nation go forward now?
It's a great question. I was talking to someone earlier about Congressman Lewis. See, when I worked for him, it was my first job out of college, and so I was the youngest person in the office. So I got tagged with some of the things that a lot of the other people didn't want to do. So a lot of times I was talking to student groups or something like that, kids who wanted to come in the office to learn about civil rights. And I was a history major, and a great honor to be able to recognize the great honor to be able to join Congressman Lewis and teaching that history to the next generation. And so I heard him get to give his talk over and over and about his involvement in the movement, the lessons he learned, the lessons he wants to teach all of us. And he would always say, he'd always end every talk with, never give up, never give in. We must never become bitter, never become hostile. You always have to be optimistic, and you have to keep the faith and keep your eyes on the prize. That was how he ended every talk, with groups who wanted to learn about him and civil rights. And I think those words ring very true. We need to keep the faith. We need to remain optimistic and keep our eyes on the prize.
What does civil rights mean to you in 2020?
It's a great question, Quintin. I think there's so many issues where we haven't come as far as we need to in terms of equity for every individual. So in our public schools, for example, the disparities between the outcomes for white students and black students is worse here in South Carolina than almost anywhere else in the country. In our economy, our income disparities, the wealth gap here is worse than, again, almost every other city in the country. It's not, I think a lot of times, I grew up here in Charleston, and a lot of times we get lulled into this sense that race problems exist everywhere, and Charleston is, especially everywhere in the South, and Charleston is just one of these many places where race problems exist. There's a lot of data actually that shows it's worse here than almost anywhere else. Our income disparities, average wage a black family earns versus a white family, is substantially worse here than even cities in neighboring states like Nashville, Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh. Those are places that, of course, have their issues too, but there's a ton of data to show that the underlying economic and education issues that cause so many disparities, those are actually worse here than anywhere. And I think we have a responsibility to address them directly, especially in the memory of Congressman Lewis.
And in a Medium post, a former president of the United States, Barack Obama, that is, called Lewis, quote, one of my heroes, unquote. That's his quote. He says this also too, quote, not many of us get to live to see our own legacy play out in such a meaningful, remarkable way. John Lewis did. And thanks to him, we now all have our marching orders to keep believing in the possibility of remaking this country we love until it lives up to its full promise. How do people remake this country with a full promise?
Well, that's a great question too, Quinn. I'll go back to something President Obama said in that statement, that he got to see his legacy play out, which was, I can't imagine a better way to put it. One of the most inspiring things about having worked for him is that every single thing in his life, just almost every little object that he touched had some significance beyond what you and I might think. Congressman Lewis had a cocktail napkin framed on the wall of his office that said, because of you, John, and it was from Barack Obama on his inauguration day. It was a lunch they had right after inauguration, and he just pulled the napkin over and wrote "because of you" on it. And this is after Congressman Lewis had spent a lifetime marching for voting rights, trying to register African Americans to vote in the South when they had never been able to. And to be able to see that progress and to have the nation's first African American president write on a napkin over lunch after his inauguration that this is because of you, I can't imagine the feeling.
And you talked about the voting rights that Congressman John Lewis fought so hard for. How will you continue that fight in the South Carolina Senate if you're elected?
It's a great question, Quintin. Congressman Lewis would be the first one to tell you that the progress we made in the civil rights movement didn't end there. And unfortunately, there has always been opposition to it, and there's always been an effort to scale some of it back. In 2013, Shelby County, Alabama, brought a case to the Supreme Court that undid a huge portion of the Voting Rights Act. And even here in South Carolina, we have some of the most restrictive voting laws in the nation. I mean, one of the only places you have to be registered 30 days in advance of an election to vote. One of the only places where you can't vote absentee without an excuse. And even during this pandemic, we're not allowing pandemic to be an excused absentee voting reason yet. We did for the primary, but we only made that effective for 1 month. So we're gonna have to fight for it again for the general election. And just, every time you stand in a line at a polling place, every time the polling place is moved, those are very subtle forms of voter suppression. I mean, we just passed a voter ID law here in South Carolina within the past decade that these voter ID laws around the country have been repeatedly proven that the intent of them was to suppress votes and to make it harder to vote and put more barriers up to voting, which we shouldn't do. And unfortunately, there's still systematic efforts to do. And so I think it's extremely important that all of our state legislators, and I certainly hope to be one of them, be leaders in the fight for voting rights and make South Carolina a place where it is easy and practical and efficient and secure to vote, because we haven't done that yet in our state, and in fact we've moved in the wrong direction in some cases.
And I interviewed state representative and now first congressional GOP nominee Nancy Mace for Quintin's close-ups a week ago, and I asked her about obviously the debate over masks and whether or not she would ask Governor McMaster to have a mask mandate in the state of South Carolina. If you were in the state senate today, what would you vote for?
Yeah, I think we do need a mask mandate right now. I mean, you look at the states that have done it versus the states that haven't, like us, and we just have these skyrocketing cases. And we're putting our families in jeopardy. I mean, right now in Charleston County, we're just struggling with this decision of how do we make schools work in the fall. And the reason that that's such a hard decision right now is because we didn't do a good enough job in the first place of getting this pandemic under control. So there are places, again, not everywhere is going through these same issues, but because we haven't done enough, we haven't taken it seriously, we haven't been aggressive enough, we're in these positions of having to deal with schools being open and closed. And back to Congressman Lewis, I was talking with some of my former colleagues in his office about if there would be a service or memorial plans, and because there's no one more deserving and more fitting to have a very large-scale, inclusive memorial that many people could attend and pay their respects and grieve together and celebrate his life together. But right now, I just don't think there's a way that we can safely do that, and it's a travesty to his memory and his family, and so many other people who have been lost in this pandemic. My own grandmother too. We have been able to have an in-person service for her, and we need to get this pandemic behind us, which means we need to get really serious and aggressive about combating it. And, it's going to be, I don't love wearing a mask either. I don't love places being closed either. But the more aggressive we can be in the short term, the faster we're going to get this out of the way in the long term. And I don't think we have state leadership that's doing that right now, and I hope to change it.
How aggressive of a school plan, reopening plan, would you have to give to your constituents if you were in office today? Would it be virtual or would it be in person?
Yeah, well, if there's one thing I learned from Congressman Lewis is you need to listen to people. You need to bring parents and teachers to the table so they have options that meet their needs. And you need to show them that you're not just giving them a seat at the table, but you're incorporating their feedback into their plans. What I'm hearing from people in our district, from parents, from teachers, is that they don't feel like they're part of that process right now. They feel like the health and safety of their family, their livelihoods are all being batted around and having decisions made for them without necessarily prioritizing them or hearing their input. And obviously the first step is we need to make that a better process to engage our community a little better on such an important issue like reopening schools.
And what's that one fun tidbit that you still remember about working for Congressman John Lewis?
One tidbit. There are a lot of them. He had a great sense of humor. He he grew up wanting to be a preacher. One of the reasons he was a great public speaker was because his entire life he had wanted to preach. And he grew up on a farm in rural Alabama, but he didn't like doing farm work. He said that from the get-go, and all his brothers and sisters used to make fun of him for trying to duck out of farm work. But he wanted to be a preacher. He saw that as his way off the farm. And so starting at 8 years old, every Sunday afternoon when he got home from church, he'd gather all the chickens in their yard, in the chicken yard, and line them up and then start preaching to them and give the Sunday sermon to the chickens as a way to practice his own ability to give a sermon. And he loved telling that story, and he was very proud that he could get them to bow their heads. Sometimes he'd get them to shake their heads. He'd never quite get them to say amen. And he was very proud of that. But every now and then, if he was feeling a little punchy, he'd mention that he thought those chickens were better listeners than some of his colleagues in the Congress.
State Senate District 41 candidate Sam Skardon, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks, Quintin. Pleasure to be here.
You're welcome.